Today, I'm excited to talk to you about restoring ecosystems in gardens and all about how we can let nature be our guide. It's not advancing. So why is ecosystem restoration in gardens important? It protects biodiversity, it improves human health, and it increases resilience to climate change. We'll talk more about what that means as we go on. I'm sorry, I don't know why this isn't advancing properly. There we go. What is an ecosystem? So it is organisms interacting with their environment as a functioning unit. So organisms are plants, bacteria, insects, animals, and their environment are abiotic elements like air, waters, minerals, and sunlight. So what is the aim of restoring ecosystems? Why are we focusing on that? It restores the function of this complex system and it increases diversity. And when we're restoring ecosystems, we're really trying to speed up nature's processes. What we'll learn is really applicable in any location because we're talking about ecosystem functions and how we restore them. We'll talk about setting restoration goals and the methods of achieving those goals. The focus of our presentation today is in Northwest Oregon, and that is because this is the area that I am most familiar with, and our examples are focused there. But as we said, this process and thought process is applicable anywhere. We are in the Willamette Valley, and also this area includes the foothills of the Cascades and Coast Ranges, and it's along two big rivers, the Columbia and Willamette. It covers three ecosystems, the Willamette Valley Region 3, Coast Range Region 1, and the West Cascades. This is the homeland of many indigenous tribes. The first people who lived here thrived here for over 11,000 years. They moved and traded along these rivers. They had complex interdependent relationships with the land. They used controlled burns to manage the grasslands, which were critical to their survival. They selectively harvest to encourage regrowth. They discovered when harvesting sweetgrass that it actually made the plot of grass come back and be more healthy. They planted camas and wapato roots as a food staple. White acorns was also a staple. They learned to manage stream flow to enhance the habitat for salmon who returned every year. In 1850, this land was dispossessed and parcelized. Because of the Donation Land Claim Act of 1850, it awarded land only primarily to white settlers, so the first people not being citizens were forced off this land, and those traditional land management practices were abandoned. In this area, populations continued to increase and ecosystems continued to be disrupted. As you look at this photograph, we are looking east. You see Mount Hood in the background. In the foreground, you see a large forested area. That is Forest Park, and we're going to talk about Forest Park coming up. And as you look towards the east, you see the industrialized landscapes and homesteads that were built that disrupted this landscape. Growing populations cause ongoing development from housing and industry, infrastructure, building water and waste and energy delivery infrastructure, transportation networks, which are all critical to maintaining life in these areas. But as a result, we lose big trees and we lose ecosystem function. The losses that result from this ecosystem disruption are tree canopy, which that causes reduced air and water quality, which pose health risks. You have continued loss of soil, which results in a loss of ability to regrow plants. You have a loss of wetlands and local biodiversity like the northern red-legged frog, which many of you may have heard about. People transport the red-legged frog across Highway 30 to go from where they live to where they breed. And without those wetlands, we lose that biodiversity of the northern red-legged frog. We see a disruption to migration routes for big animals. Loss of vegetation and roads interfere with terrestrial migration for species like the Roosevelt elk, the cougar deer. Roads and narrow culverts block salmon migration. Salmon are required to return to the streams in which they bred to complete their life cycle as they travel between the oceans and the streams. And when we have barriers to migration, those populations decrease. The Pacific Northwest is on the Pacific Flyway. Birds migrate from as far north as Alaska and Canada to South America. Millions of birds fly through in the fall and spring, raptors and songbirds, a lot of waterfowl. They're seeking food and shelter in overwintering sites. When we lose tree canopy and wetlands, it reduces not only our local bird populations, but the migrating birds cannot find this food, shelter, and overwintering sites they're seeking. Fragmented landscapes also disrupt plant migration. We may not think of plants as migrating, but we can observe that plants are actually migrating north and up to higher elevations as the climate warms. It's a survival tactic when they aren't thriving in the areas where they used to grow because of increased temperatures. Plants, especially trees, require contiguous landscapes to move their ranges for seed dispersal. As you will see here in this slide, from 2012 to 2020, Portland moved from the plant hardiness zone of 8B to 9A. So plant hardiness zones are based on average annual coldest temperature. And in this area, I actually put in my zip code, that temperature has changed by increasing 2 degrees. So the plants that thrived here before may not thrive. Degraded ecosystems aren't as resilient. Ecosystems are stressed from climate change. Trees are slow to adapt to climatic changes and require decades of adaptation. Degraded ecosystems are less able to bounce back from disturbances like fire. Restoration is happening in these areas at larger scales. Public, private, nonprofit, tribal partners are working together to restore landscapes. Restoration is aimed at restoring these terrestrial corridors so that large mammals can move through the area, restoring waterways to allow fish passage, particularly for salmon species, and also restoring these landscapes across this area, provide more access for people to food and access to green space. Restored ecosystems support human health. Trees and vegetation filter water and air toxins. They reduce floods. They provide shade. They reduce risk of wildfire. Access to green spaces also provides recreation, which has health benefits, as we all know. It can reduce cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease. Much evidence is that being out in green spaces reduces rates of depression. It improves student performance and provides access to food. I am very grateful that the first peoples who lived here, their descendants, bring traditional knowledge to help inform restoration. So when we think about restoration, we are trying to return landscapes to conditions where they support a wide diversity of native plants. Indigenous people have brought information forward to say, what are the native plants that grew here and what were their uses? Through the identification of ecosystem markers, they judge ecosystem health. Indigenous tribes were one of the first to raise a red flag saying the salmon runs are not returning, which led biologists and scientists to understand what was happening in the higher watersheds that was blocking the return of salmon runs. They have brought information about how to use fire to restore landscapes to continue to produce and to reduce the risk of wildfires. They have taught about adding wood and meander to streams to create a more healthy habitat for salmonid species, and the observation that beavers restore wetlands, and those restored wetlands create fire barriers, which is all important parts of thinking about restoring a landscape. Gardeners can also help restore ecosystems. We can restore at small scales, create local habitats, increase access to food and green spaces. So how do we do that? We started out saying, let nature be our guide. So we are looking at these complex ecosystems and say, how do they function? What are the ecological principles that guide them? And turn those into restoration goals. Principle one, everything is connected. So we think about our ecosystem and you have biotic and abiotic elements all working together. So one of our goals is to reconnect those landscapes and also reconnect habitat corridors, allowing migration. Principle two, everything must go somewhere. On Earth, we have a finite set of resources and everything cycles through the Earth in different forms. Importantly, for plant growth, we want to restore water and nutrient cycles. Earth's elements continuously cycle in different forms. So water, carbon, plant nutrients circulate through the Earth systems in different forms. And when you fragment landscapes, it disrupts these flows. So our goal is to restore those cycles. Principle three, nature knows best. So observe nature. Goal three, strive for diversity of plants, which in turn supports the diversity of all other organisms. If you look at this image right here, you can count at least 8 species, and those species support a diversity species of plants, which support a diversity of organisms. So when we talk about watch what nature does, plants adapt. That's how they have changed over time to fill ecological niches. Plants adapt to avoid competing with each other for light, nutrients, and water. As you can see here, these plants all have different adaptations. Squash grow, trail, and vine to get more sun. Spiky holly plants aren't edible by most animals, so they have protected themselves. So each plant species plays a unique role in an ecosystem. Organisms also adapt to feed on different plants. So all life feeds on plants. Without plants, we would have no life on this planet. These life adapts to feed on roots, flowers, leaves, and the greater the diversity of the species, the more resilient an ecosystem. So what do we mean by that? Ecosystem resilience, what is it? It's the ability for an ecosystem to rebound after a disturbance. So here's a fun picture of an ecosystem that has a lot of diversity. These triangles are trees. And what we want to look and observe here is that high diversity means high resilience. So these are disturbances, particularly with climate change. We have high heat, drought, increased risk of floods, and pests. So say we have a pest and it kills one species of trees, killed the light green trees. And let's say that is an emerald ash borer. If it kills just the ash trees and we have other species of trees, they will fill in that gap and the system rebounds. What if there's only one species of trees? And these could be ash trees. This is an emerald ash borer. If all those trees die out, then you no longer have a forested ecosystem. So that ecosystem lacks resilience. It doesn't have the ability to rebound. So if we go back then to think about our restoration goals, we say we are going to reconnect ecosystems and fragmented habitats, restore natural water and nutrient cycles, strive for diversity, and that creates resilience. So let's go back and look at our picture here and the number of species that are growing in this forested ecosystem. So one way to say, how do I go from a landscape that I want to restore? How do I go from what it looks like today to what I want it to be? So first observe nature, observe a native landscape. Look at plant diversity. How many species of plants are there? As I mentioned, there are about 8 different species of plants. Look at the soil. Is it exposed? Is it covered? What about vertical diversity? So if you see here, this is a big leaf maple, which is a very tall tree. Red alders are smaller. You have sword ferns, licorice ferns. You've got ground covers. So you've got vertical diversity happening in this landscape. Look how the plants grow in groups. What else is living here? Insects, birds, what do you see? Sketch and take photos for reference so you can remind yourself what you're observing. So let's observe Forest Park. What is the history of Forest Park? It is a forest remnant that exists right here in the center of the Portland metro area. Here's a close-up of it. It's a 5,200 acre conifer and hardwood forest. It was clear cut for building materials in the 1800s, has very steep slopes, so the soil eroded from logging. Down trees or down wood was removed for fuel, and severe invasion of non-invasive plants happened. We are working as partners to restore this ecosystem. So using our goals, we want to reconnect those landscapes that are disrupted, you can see here. We want to restore water and nutrient cycles and diversify the vegetation. And if you look here, you say, well, that looks like a pretty healthy ecosystem. Why would I need to restore it? Here is another view of part of Forest Park. Sorry for the blurry photo, but I think it gives you the full scope of some of the extreme invasion. This is English ivy that is happening in Forest Park. So let's look at a healthy area of the park. What do we observe? So let's go back to thinking about vertical diversity. We have very big trees, Douglas fir trees. We have large shrubs, small trees, a lot of downed wood. We have ferns and mosses, lichen. In the downed wood, we can observe fungus and insects and life in the soil. So this is a complex, diverse, functioning ecosystem. So if we think about that in terms of function, what roles are all of these organisms playing in this environment? Restoring nutrient cycles, that is one of the aims of restoration. So in the areas where we don't have this healthy vegetation and the ecosystem was degraded from the removal of downed wood, downed trees are now left, snags are left in place. The downed wood decomposes to form soil. Down logs and snags provide shelter and food for wildlife. And this nurse log here provides a footing for seedlings to take hold. So you have trees regenerating. Restoring nutrient cycles is key when you're looking at the breakdown of plant and animal materials on the soil. And by relieving downed wood or adding downed wood, we are speeding up that soil regeneration process. Decomposing organisms in the soil break down plant and animal materials, fungal networks and other organisms operating in the soil help plants reabsorb nutrients. Carbon is stored in the soil, acids broken down, which reduces atmospheric carbon, which is really important when we're thinking about how soils help mitigate climate change by reducing atmospheric CO2. Restored soil in itself is a living organism. It's the body of countless microbes, insects, arthropods, fungi. It's broken down plant material, animal tissue, and feces. In a teaspoon of healthy forest soil, you can find millions of organisms. Nitrogen cycling, as we know, nitrogen is one of the limiters for plant growth, and nitrogen cannot be absorbed in most of the naturally occurring forms of nitrogen. So in a forest, there needs to be help for plants to absorb nitrogen. Red alder is one of the trees that fixes nitrogen in its roots, and red alder loves sun. So they come in early when there's a disturbance. They fix nitrogen in the soil, allowing Douglas fir trees, for example, to come in behind and absorb nutrients. This was a discovery only about 20 to 30 years ago in an old growth Douglas fir forest in Oregon. And it was curious to scientists to say, how do these old growth forests get nitrogen in forms they can use when you don't have any red alder trees growing because the canopy is closed and there's no light? It was discovered that Loberian lichen fix nitrogen. They grow in the tops of trees that are over 100 years old, fall on the ground, and that allows the plants to have a source of fixed nitrogen. So how are water cycles being restored in these big forest lands? It requires ongoing tree recruitment for these forests to continue to be forests. So as we talked about, the downwood was removed, there was loss of soil. So building up the soil is critical so those new trees can continue to grow. Living trees hold enormous amounts of water. Big forests create weather through transpiration. Big trees also have deep roots. They infiltrate water into the soils and they charge the groundwater. So big trees, forested ecosystems create natural water cycles. The other way to restore water cycles is to leave debris on the soil and plant a diversity of plants. Downwood holds in moisture like a sponge, which is really important when you think about the role of forests in preventing wildfires. Leaves and plant debris on the soil prevent soil evaporation. Organic rich soils, which are restored by these materials going back into the soil, hold water. And dense vegetation reduces soil evaporation. So lastly, our third goal is to restore diversity. So in Forest Park in particular, removing invasive plants is critical. They exclude other plants from growing. They reduce diversity of all life, and they weaken trees. And this ivy was introduced. There's two ways that it was introduced. One, by coming in from the neighborhoods where it was planted as an ornamental. The other way, it was actually planted on the steep slopes to keep the banks from eroding. The other way that diversity is being restored is by planting native plants, replanting the plants that were growing there before. And importantly, to plant tree seedlings in gaps. So when you have blowdown in Forest Park and the trees are on the ground, they're left there to restore the soil, and people come in afterward to plant tree seedlings in the gap. Because they're light loving, they plant alders so that there is a method for nitrogen introduction, followed by Douglas fir, which are also sun loving trees. So how is all that applicable to a garden? We don't all necessarily want to grow a forest ecosystem in our garden, but we can apply what we learn by observing nature. One, set your goals, reconnect systems and function, restore cycles, and aim for diversity. So first, let's talk about soil in a garden. Restore soil structure and diversity. Don't till. So not tilling your garden and minimizing digging preserves the soil structure. It retains air pockets in the soil, which plant roots need in order to survive. It increases diversity and abundance of soil organisms. If you do not dig in the soil, you allow those ecosystems to naturally evolve and to support fungal networks, which help plants access nutrients. So as you see here, we're already talking about this is a system that if you look at one part of it, what you do in the soil becomes very critical for how plants grow. So avoid soil disturbance. Another way to avoid soil disturbance is creating paths or trails. It reduces soil compaction, so you're walking only on the areas that are designated. It provides a guide for planting also, which I find really helpful, is plant small plants along the path and move upward to larger plants in the center of a garden. It can make the space of your garden also feel larger. We already talked a great deal about adding wood, but adding it to your garden speeds soil restoration. Add nurse logs, plant in them. They are creative and beautiful, and eventually those nurse logs are decomposing to feed the soil. Use logs to define garden pathways. As they decompose, they return organic matter to the soil. They also provide habitats for insects and amphibians, and they look attractive. Leave and add leaves and other plant materials. They hold water in the soil. They reduce the risk of weeds invading your soil. They add carbon to the soil, which we talked about being very important because the carbon soil increases, we reduce it in the atmosphere. Leaves can reduce compaction and soil erosion by protecting the soil. This is an example of using them on a crop bed during the winter. A guideline is cover the soil and plants with plants and mulch. Bare soil invites weeds. Bare soil can evaporate water. So cover the soil with plants to create diversity. As you're restoring, adding arborist wood chips can help increase soil diversity. And as you see here, evidence of fungi coming back in. Always in gardens, it's important to keep some soil bare for wild bees. 70% of them nest in the ground. Another way to speed restoration is using what we call cover crops to cover the soil. These are fast-growing plants. They're not generally native, but these are plants that temporarily can grow and improve soil quality and cover the ground, keeping weeds out. Some species of cover crops like crimson clover and vetch add nitrogen. They fix nitrogen. So you're speeding up the availability of nitrogen for other plants. Daikon radish, pictured here on the top left, breaks up soil compaction by these big roots that grow into the soil. Lacey Phacelia, pictured below, provides food for pollinators. This is a way to cover the soil, to add organic matter, to prevent weeds. And Lacey Phacelia is a great pollinator plant. You do want to cut these down before they go to seed, most of them, so that you are adding the value of the cover crop, but it is not continuing to grow. It's a method of allowing slower growing plants to establish underneath. Very importantly, we've talked from the beginning of this presentation about the value of big trees. Protect and care for them on small landscapes. It takes years for them to grow. They clean the air, they provide shade, store water, they help build the soil by dropping leaves and litter on the soil. The big roots help water infiltrate the soil and recharge groundwater aquifers. And in our hotter, drier summers in this area, it's really important to water our big trees. This shows you a guide to say some of them are more drought tolerant than others. But for those that are not drought tolerant, and really for any big trees that are in an urban environment that are open to wind, saturate the ground below the drip line. Water deeply and slowly, at least once a month in hot, dry summers. If there is an extreme heat event, water once a week. Avoid fertilizer near trees because it makes them increase their water intake. And add 2 to 4 inches of mulch along the drip line. Don't mound it next to the tree, but along the drip line. So take care of big trees in gardens. Here's an example of one of the things that's happening in the Pacific Northwest is western red cedar dieback. One of the hypotheses is they have shallow roots, so they can't reach water in years of drought. So they pull their water back to protect the rest of the plant, and the top of the trees die. Eventually, fungus can get in and they die back. Method of restoring water cycles in gardens are a couple of methods. Create a bioswale. A bioswale is you create this by digging a trench, you line it with rocks and edge it with plants. It's really beautiful. It allows stormwater to soak into the ground and reduces runoff and also traps pollutants so they don't get into our waterways. Another method of restoring water cycles in gardens is creating rain gardens. This is slightly different in shape, but similar in function to a bioswale. You dig a depression in your garden, plant with grasses, ground covers. It recharges the groundwater, helps reduce flooding, and filters the water, and also adds a beautiful addition to gardens. Another way to restore water cycles is disconnecting downspouts where it's viable. It manages stormwater runoff. So rainwater is directed away from your house and into your yard, but you've got to have good drainage to use this method. Direct the water to a lawn or a rain garden. Support biodiversity and human health. One of the things to consider is when you're in an urban environment, what you put on your driveways, on your landscapes can run into our rivers. So avoid oil and fuel leakage on driveways where it can get washed into these drains. Avoid the use of chemical to control moss or weeds or pests on hard surfaces. They can wash into the natural waterways and they are toxic to wildlife and humans. So think about our ecosystems and our effort to support biodiversity. Avoid doing things that can damage it. So how do we increase diversity in our gardens? Let's focus now on plants. Remove invasive plants and plant primarily native plants. Remove invasive weeds. They outcompete beneficial plants. They have no natural predators because they were introduced. They can take over a landscape and remove them mechanically if at all possible. Yes, you're going to have to dig to remove some of them, but that's okay. Dig to remove them, be persistent, and the soil will recover. If you use some chemicals on the landscape, it destroys the biodiversity in that area and lands can be slower to recover. Here are some invasive plants that we probably all know, and some of them we may not even think about as invasive plants, but all of them were introduced through the nursery industry. So shiny geranium has become a real pest in that it blankets landscapes and prevents other plants from growing. The yellow flag iris clog wetlands, they take over. Purple loosestrife has become a pest in wetlands. Wild clematis vines up trees and can smother them. So really the thought here is when you plant something, know your plants. If you go to a nursery and it says, here is a new cultivar, it's aggressive, you might want to wait and say, is that really something I want to plant in my yard? could it potentially become invasive and escape to the wild like the ivy escaped to Forest Park? Increase diversity with native plants. So what do we mean by native plants? Native plants are plants that are adapted to the location. So they are adapted to the soil conditions, they're adapted to the climate, and they support local wildlife because these plants and the wildlife have grown and adapted together. They often require less water. They're adapted to the soils in the wild. They don't get regular water during the summer. And when plants require less water in our garden, we use less water, which means there's cooler water in the rivers during the summer, which improves salmon survival. So once again, we go back to our principle one, everything is connected. When you water your garden, it pulls it out of the rivers. If you can leave more water in the rivers during the summer months, you get better survival of aquatic species. So that's a lot of things to consider. So let's talk about what to plant. So we've talked about minimizing disruption of soils to increase their diversity. We've talked about removing invasive plants, protecting big trees. So then what do I plant? So one approach to a garden is think about hedgerows. So hedgerows are an interesting structure to create because it can create a barrier. Here we see a hedgerow that is created in a community garden to create a barrier between the garden and the neighborhood. It can be used on small farmlands to create windbreaks and provide pollinators to crop plants. And they can be very beautiful. This particular hedgerow, there are crops planted adjacent to it. So the pollinators that visit this hedgerow also serve as pollinators for crop plants. So hedgerows, you establish multiple canopy layers, cover the ground, and hopefully have a diverse group of blooms that last all summer. Naturescape beds for wildlife. So naturescape are more shade-loving areas in a garden. And this is showing at Cascara, we have salal. There are 5 canopy layers. The ground is covered either with plants or arborist wood chips. This provides multiple canopy layers and dense plantings. So why do we care about these multiple canopy layers that we've been talking about? That creates vertical diversity, and the more vertical diversity you have, it supports more wildlife. This is an image that we borrowed from the Backyard Habitat program in this area, which talks about the different species of birds that are supported by each canopy layer. If you don't have those canopy layers, those birds don't have the shelter and food sources. So thinking about vertical layers is one way to think about supporting wildlife diversity. If you don't want a forested landscape, and if you have big property, maybe you live in a more rural area, restoring prairie landscapes is an option. So this is the Camasia Nature Reserve that's near Oregon City. Here are planted white oaks. They existed there, but this area was restored by the Nature Conservancy. There are white oaks, madrones, native grasses, wildflowers. They get no water in summer. So this is an option if you have a different kind of landscapes. Look at a white oak prairie and how can you emulate what is growing there? We'll emphasize that these are native plants that indigenous peoples relied on for survival. Establish a wildflower meadow. It doesn't have to be as large as this particular landscape. You can do it in smaller areas. This shows Oregon sunshine. Hairy vetch is growing here. This is a nitrogen fixer, and Oregon checker bloom. If you have an area of your yard that is sun-loving, plant a mix of native and non-native plants to support pollinators. You don't have to stick with 100% native plants. If you've got favorite plants, if you've got plants that maybe are surviving better in hotter, drier summers, do a mix of natives and non-natives, and observe what type of insects it supports. Replace grass monocultures. So when you talk about adding diversity, lawns and grasses are a monoculture, the opposite of striving for diversity. One method to remove them is by mulching them. So here on the left, we see a grass monoculture. The grass was cut. Grass was added, and that adds a carbon element. Compost was added, that provides nitrogen. You layer leaves, that's another carbon layer. Add more compost and arborist wood chips. So what you're doing is you're artificially building soil and speeding up that process. So here is that grass a year later. This was turned into a series of vegetable beds and pollinator beds, which are to the back of this space. So in a year, you could move from a monoculture to diverse plantings that support wildlife and people. Integrate crops and native beds to support diverse insect populations. So when we think about crops, we're thinking, well, we want pollinator insects. We also think about pests. If you've got diverse landscapes around you, you start to build an ecosystem that supports insects that are both predators and pests and pollinators. So you get this balanced ecosystem, so your insect populations are in balance. Here is a great study that was done by the Garden Ecology Lab at OSU. This was a study that looked at mix of native plants and lavender, which is not a native plant, and said what kind of diverse native bee species are supported by these plants. I encourage you to look at this study. There is a lot of great detail that talks about what kind of bees frequent these plants and what are the best ones to put in your garden if you want to establish a diverse bee population. And they're beautiful and they're native. And here are just some of them up close that you can look at. These bloom at different times. You can look at their bloom times, have overlapping blooms so that you have continuous bloom that not only is beautiful, but supports insect populations. So that was a lot of information. So let's go over and just think, how do I go from observing a landscape and managing it in a small space? Always observe. When you go into a garden space, look at what's happening. Go out daily. What's thriving in changing climate conditions? What plants are thriving? What insects do you see? How is the soil looking? What birds do you observe? Move plants. If they aren't doing well, move them around. You can move them to different areas of sunlight. You can try to improve the soil, move a plant into an area of land where you've restored the soil. Move them, remove them if they're not thriving. Plant more of the plants that are thriving. And importantly, when we're thinking about big trees do age. So plant trees for succession. Plant different species so you have that resilience of not just having one tree species on your land, but multiple ones so they don't all succumb to a pest. Add canopy layers where you can. And if you think about what you can do, if you have a garden space, restore your garden. If you don't have a garden space, volunteer with other organizations, restore community spaces, work in community gardens, restore parklands, volunteer. This is Friends of Trees and Forest Park Conservancy are restoring Forest Park here. They depend all on volunteers to help support those efforts. Follow policies. Look at what policies are being in place that might support restoration programs and spread the word. Talk to people and say, here's what I'm doing in my yard because. We are all part of nature, so let's let it be our guide. Here are resources that will be sent to you along with the link to the recording of this session. And I am open for questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and talk with y'all.
That's pretty impressive, Carol. That's a lot of information.
Thanks, Justin.
So, yes, we got questions.
Okay.
One was, more and more we've been hearing about the importance of removing combustibles to prevent wildfire, and especially in the context of we've spent so many years suppressing fire that we've got mammoth fuel buildups. So how do you balance the removal of fuel to prevent wildfires with leaving down trees for nutrient cycling and for regrowth support?
Great question. I'm going to use Forest Park as a real example. So in some areas of this park that are the healthiest, they're healthy because there is a lot of downed wood. And what has been shown is that downed wood, as we talked about, retains a lot of moisture. It's like a sponge. So not only is water held in those logs, but it increases the water storage in the soil. So when you have a healthy ecosystem with downed wood, water retention in the soil, those can actually act as fire breaks if you have a wildfire go through. So it's a long-term process to go from where we have been to saying these are monoculture forests. There's a lot of dry wood that's downed. Those can serve as fuel for wildfires. So how you manage your ecosystem has to keep in mind these water cycles and what you're trying to create. And one of the methods that indigenous peoples have been teaching is where you burn excess fuel so that you create these fire breaks, and where you retain moisture in forests that can also act as forest breaks. So it's an ongoing area of study, more complex than we can probably talk about here, but a lot of great research is ongoing and a lot of different restoration methods being employed.
Huh. So another question that's shown up in several forms is, what if you don't live in the Willamette Valley? What, on the one hand, you'd like to get involved in the restoration of the larger ecosystem. On the other hand, you'd like to use your own garden as a miniature restoration project. So how do you connect with larger scale restoration? And how do you find like lists of plants that are appropriate for your?
Yeah, good question. So we have the benefit in the Willamette Valley to have the Portland plant list, which is a comprehensive, very extensive list of plants that are native in this area that thrive. Other areas, I would suggest going back to your extension service to see if you can find lists of native plants. The process is the same. Wherever you live, go out and find a natural area that is healthy. And if it's something that you want to emulate in your garden, use the same process. What's growing there? It may not be giant Douglas fir trees, but you may have some other kind of large species of plant. And look what's growing and say, I am going to translate that and try to recreate that in my garden. So you may have different soils. So what kind of plants thrive in those soils? Does the soil need to be restored? How much water do these plants take? Ideally, if you're living in a hot, dry climate, you find plants that don't need so much water. So use the same thinking process as go observe what's growing in your area. Look at what's growing in natural areas, try to identify those tree species, and reach out to local organizations to say, do you have a list of what's native in my area? And then observe, plant, observe what's growing, what do you change, strive for diversity always. So try different combinations, but plant densely for diversity so that you're supporting a diverse ecosystem.
Hmm. Okay. I know Bend, for instance, has gotten big enough that they have recommended plant lists. Unfortunately, smaller, less densely populated areas have fewer resources. But you're right. People can go out and look and see what's there.
Yeah.
Talk to other gardeners who've been involved in this process for many years. Another
Yes, I think
question.
joining organizations that study this, find like-minded people, and who knows what you might discover.
Right. And there have been organizations in all of our ecosystems involved in restoration. Sometimes they're much more low key than in the Willamette Valley.
Yeah.
So another question, in natural forests, trees grow close enough together that their canopies interlock. And when we plant trees, we tend to space them out so that we get specimen trees. Okay. Should we be planting in the restoration with an eye toward restoration? Should we be planting more closely so that we're getting actual canopy cover, or do specimen trees really provide the same function?
Great question. Trees grow in an ecosystem. In a natural forest, you don't generally see trees growing isolated by themselves, not coniferous trees and not most hardwood trees. If you have just a specimen tree, it's at risk of drying out. It's at risk of wind. So when you think about creating an ecosystem, think about that diversity is yes, rarely do you see a specimen tree. Or if you have one tree species that's a large tree, think about planting another smaller tree under it so you're creating a mini ecosystem. Generally, you always want to try to plant two or three of the same species of trees so they can reproduce. And also it creates a supporting structure at different levels. So strive for diversity. That is like my number one mantra when I go look at something is, do I have one tree that's sitting alone, or am I looking at a set of diverse plants that that work together to maintain themselves as a reproductive ecosystem?
Yes. And the scale of what we have, the land that we have control over, also makes a difference. Obviously,
Yeah.
somebody that has 20 acres or 40 acres can be thinking along this. I have noticed, because I'm a city person here in Portland,
Uh-huh.
several neighborhoods now include folks who are working together as sort of shared projects to
Yes.
have common backyards. And even if they're not shared backyards, to plant in a coordinated way, that
Yes.
even though they may only have control of an eighth of an acre, they're creating forests that cover an acre or two.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up. Is the larger the area we can restore, the more function that you restore and the more resilient it is. So if you think about our little diagram, as if you've got one tree species and a single tree in your yard, say it's an ash tree and an emerald ash borer comes in and kills it, you've lost your canopy cover. If you've got people willing to look at their landscapes together, you're expanding the diversity of your ecosystem by what is growing on all those lands, and expanding the acreage will make that system more resilient. So it is a great effort, and backyard habitat program in Portland really encourages that sort of thing. Neighbors talk to neighbors, people come together and say, how do we create a better, more resilient ecosystem? Because ultimately you're creating a stronger, more resilient community ecosystem for people. So I love those partnerships, local partnerships of landowners. Or even with a school ground. Doesn't have to be a landowner owner. You can include a school ground and try to help restore that.
That's a very good point because schools, churches, mosques, synagogues
Yes,
frequently have control over a larger piece of the earth and can be encouraged to do restoration.
yes, we're actually working on a project with Portland Public Schools, Master Gardener programs to restore a landscape that's adjacent to other community gardens so that we are restoring a larger landscape. It's a great local effort.
Oh, I know that park bureaus also are frequently, they're more willing to engage in a project like this if there are volunteers who step forward and say, I'll help, and you can
Ab-
count on me for several years.
Absolutely. Yeah. Power of volunteers.
Uh, so another question that comes up here. All right. Yes, we've observed our previously existing ecosystem. We figured out what will be happiest here. And we look at what we really have, and of course, it's completely different because it's filled with weeds and invasives and stuff that's been neglected for years. And so when we go in to remove existing plants so that we can replace them with more desirable ones, obviously, a lot of those strategies for removing plants are not going to be very healthy for microorganisms or amphibians or other things that are hanging on in what we've got. How do we do the transition carefully?
So I go back and say, how does nature function and what part of speeding up nature can I use to battle the invasives because it's real and it's hard? Remove them manually, do it over and over again. Cover that earth with mulch so they don't come back in. Cover it with cover crops so that you have something that's aggressively growing that are really pretty good for the landscape, even if they aren't your ultimate um, desired result. But it takes work and it takes collaboration and um, stay after it and use these methods to try to rebuild a diverse native landscape. I think Cheryl's telling us we're out of time, but thank you very much. Thanks, Justin, for the great questions and everybody out there.
Good. I think we're in good shape. We'll wrap it
Okay,
up.
thank you very much.